Kyle Long was 34 years old, an overnight maintenance technician in downtown Denver. Most people in Pike and Rowe Tower barely noticed him unless an elevator stopped moving or a boiler started leaking. They thought he was broke, tired, ordinary. The kind of man who drank gas station coffee alone at midnight and drove home in a dented Ford Ranger with rust around the wheel wells. What they didn't know was that Kyle had spent months quietly documenting everything. At 2:17 a.m., Rebecca opened the apartment door just long enough to throw a black trash bag onto the frozen concrete walkway. $40 fluttered out and slapped against Kyle's work boot. Then he heard another man laughing inside the apartment before the chain lock slid shut. Before we keep going, drop your country and local time in the comments. I always like seeing where these stories are reaching people. And if you enjoy slow-burn revenge stories built on patience evidence and quiet comebacks, subscribe now. Tomorrow's story gets even colder. Rebecca Long had once told Kyle that she loved how calm he was. That was back when they rented a one-bedroom apartment near South Broadway with cracked kitchen tiles and a heater that rattled every winter night. Back when they ate takeout Chinese food sitting on the floor because they couldn't afford a couch yet. Back when Kyle still believed exhaustion and loyalty naturally turned into stability. 3 years later, Rebecca no longer called his calmness maturity. She called it weakness. Kyle worked nights at Pike and Rowe Tower in downtown Denver, a 38-story glass building filled with law firms, investment groups, and tech startups that kept neon logos glowing past midnight. His shift started at 6:00 p.m. and ended at 4:30 in the morning. Most tenants never learned his name. They only saw flashes of him pushing a gray maintenance cart through polished hallways while carrying pressure gauges, wiring kits, or HVAC filters. His navy work jacket always smelled faintly of machine oil and cold air. Rebecca hated that smell. By the time Kyle got home each morning to their apartment in Aurora, Rebecca was usually already awake, sitting cross-legged on the couch with coffee balanced beside her laptop, scrolling through luxury apartment listings she couldn't afford. "Look at this kitchen," she said one morning without looking up. "Quartz counters, floor-to-ceiling windows. This is what people our age are living in now." Kyle loosened his boots near the front door. Snowmelt darkened the entry rug. "It's nice," he said quietly. Rebecca glanced toward him, toward the work jacket, toward the tired eyes. "That's all you ever say?" Kyle didn't answer. He rarely defended himself anymore because arguments with Rebecca had stopped sounding like conversations months ago. They sounded more like performance reviews. Rebecca worked as a leasing consultant for Aspen Ridge Luxury Living near Cherry Creek. The job changed her slowly at first. Better clothes, straighter posture, more attention to appearances. Then came the brunch photos, rooftop bars, girls' weekends in Scottsdale, and conversations filled with people Kyle had never met. Developers, brokers, contractors, men who wore expensive watches casually. Kyle noticed everything. He simply never announced it. He noticed Rebecca locking her phone screen faster whenever he walked into the room. He noticed restaurant charges at places neither of them could afford. He noticed she stopped asking how his shifts went. One Thursday morning, Kyle came home with grease still streaked across his forearm after spending 6 straight hours repairing a failed circulation pump in the tower basement. Rebecca stood near the bathroom mirror, applying makeup. "You know," she said casually, "Trevor thinks it's insane that you're still doing maintenance work at 34. Kyle washed his hands slowly in the sink. "Who's Trevor, a contractor I met through work?" The answer came too quickly, too rehearsed. Kyle dried his hands with a paper towel. "What kind of contractor? Commercial development?" Rebecca shrugged. "Successful one?" There it was again, successful. She used the word differently now, like it belonged to a separate species of men. Kyle opened the refrigerator. Half a gallon of milk, eggs, leftover pasta in a cracked plastic container. Rebecca watched him from the mirror reflection. "You could have done more with yourself, Kyle." He closed the refrigerator carefully. "I'm working." That's not what I mean. No. He knew exactly what she meant. Rebecca no longer measured men by reliability, or patience, or whether they came home every night. She measured them by square footage and monthly income. That same weekend, Kyle met Trevor Hale for the first time. Not officially. He saw him through the apartment window. A black GMC Denali pulled into the parking lot just after 9:00 p.m. Rebecca had told Kyle she was having wine with coworkers downtown. But when Kyle stepped outside to take trash bags to the dumpster, he saw Rebecca climbing out of the passenger seat, laughing at something Trevor said. Trevor was tall, broad-shouldered, expensive-looking without trying too hard. Camel overcoat, bright white sneakers despite the snow. The kind of man who carried confidence like cologne. Rebecca spotted Kyle near the dumpster. Her smile disappeared immediately. Trevor followed her gaze. Kyle expected embarrassment. Instead, Trevor smirked slightly and extended a hand like they were networking at a conference. "You must be Kyle." Kyle shook his hand once. "Trevor, Rebecca talks about you." Kyle looked at Rebecca briefly. She crossed her arms against the cold. "Trevor owns Hale Commercial Solutions," she said. "They're doing 3 developments near Boulder." Trevor smiled again. "Trying to survive out here." Kyle nodded once. The silence stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. Trevor finally laughed. "Well, I'll let you two get inside." "Freezing out here." Kyle watched the Denali disappear through falling snow. Rebecca immediately grabbed her phone and headed toward the apartment stairs. "You embarrassed me." Kyle looked at her. "I said hello. You looked at him like you hated him." Kyle's expression didn't change. "I don't know him," Rebecca scoffed. "Exactly. That attitude, that's the problem." Inside the apartment, she poured herself another glass of wine, while Kyle sat at the kitchen counter eating microwaved leftover pasta from a paper bowl. The dishwasher hummed softly. Rebecca leaned against the counter across from him. "Do you know what it feels like being around ambitious people all day and then coming home to—" She gestured vaguely toward him. This Kyle set the fork down carefully. "What does that mean? It means everyone else is moving forward. I'm paying our bills. You're maintaining survival, Kyle, not building a life." The words landed hard because she genuinely believed them, and Kyle could tell. He studied the small scratches across the countertop instead of looking at her. 3 nights later, during his shift break, Kyle sat alone in the Pike Rowe maintenance office, drinking burnt coffee from a vending machine cup while snow battered the building windows, 20 floors above downtown Denver. The office television played muted financial news. A billionaire CEO smiled across the screen. Kyle pulled out his phone. 1 missed call from Rebecca. 2 text messages. "Don't forget rent is due. And please park your truck farther away this weekend. We're having people over." Kyle stared at the second message longer than the first. "Your truck. Not our truck. Not home. Not us." At 3:12 a.m., a fire alarm malfunction triggered on the 31st floor. Kyle spent 40 minutes tracing faulty wiring through freezing mechanical corridors while tenants complained downstairs about elevator delays. By sunrise, his shoulders ached so badly he could barely lift his toolbox. When he finally pulled into the apartment parking lot, Trevor's black Denali was parked 3 spaces from the building entrance. Snow covered the windshield, meaning it had been there all night. Kyle turned off the truck engine, but didn't move immediately. The parking lot was silent except for the ticking sound of his cooling engine. Then faintly through the apartment building walls above him, he heard Rebecca laughing. Not the polite laugh she used with coworkers. The real one. Kyle rested both hands on the steering wheel. Cold morning light spilled across the dashboard. And for the first time in years, something inside him became very still. Kyle stayed inside the truck for nearly 20 minutes that morning. The engine had gone cold. Frost slowly crept across the lower corners of the windshield, while Rebecca's laughter echoed faintly from somewhere above the parking garage. He should have gone upstairs immediately, Most husbands would have. Most husbands would have kicked the apartment door open and demanded answers loud enough for neighbors to hear. Kyle simply sat there with both hands resting on the steering wheel, watching, thinking. The security light above Building C flickered every 7 seconds. Snow slid from the apartment roofs in soft collapses. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked behind a fence. Kyle finally stepped out of the truck at 7:14 a.m. The cold hit instantly through his work jacket. Trevor's Denali still sat near the entrance, glossy black, beneath a layer of snow and salt residue. Temporary contractor permit hanging from the mirror, expensive tires, heated seats probably still warm from the drive over. Kyle walked past it without touching the hood. Inside the apartment stairwell, the smell of perfume and stale wine drifted through the hallway. Their apartment door was unlocked. Kyle entered quietly. Rebecca stood in the kitchen wearing an oversized sweatshirt Kyle had bought her 2 Christmases earlier. Trevor sat at the counter drinking coffee from one of Kyle's old Broncos mugs like he belonged there. Nobody looked surprised. That part settled deepest. Rebecca folded her arms. "You're home early." Kyle set his toolbox beside the wall carefully. "My shift ended." Trevor stood up halfway awkward suddenly. "I was just leaving." Kyle looked at him once. Trevor grabbed his coat immediately. Rebecca didn't stop him. The apartment stayed silent until the front door closed behind Trevor. Then Rebecca exhaled sharply like she was tired of pretending. "We should probably stop doing this." Kyle removed his gloves finger by finger. "Doing what?" "This marriage." The words came clean, practiced, like she had already rehearsed the speech several times in her head. Kyle walked toward the sink and rinsed grease from his hands. "You want a divorce?" Rebecca laughed quietly. "You make it sound dramatic." Kyle shut the water off. She leaned against the kitchen counter. "I'm exhausted, Kyle. I'm 32 years old and still budgeting groceries with coupons while everyone around me is actually building something. We pay rent. That's not building a life." There it is again. Rebecca's eyes hardened slightly. "Because it's true." Kyle dried his hands slowly with a dish towel. Outside the apartment window, traffic crawled through fresh snow toward Interstate 225. Gray morning light filled the kitchen. Rebecca lowered her voice. "You know what the problem is?" Kyle didn't answer. "You're comfortable being average." The sentence stayed in the room a long time. Kyle looked toward the refrigerator, where old utility bills were attached with magnets beside a faded wedding photo from Estes Park. In the picture, Rebecca smiled with both hands around his arm, like she was holding on to something permanent. Now she wouldn't even look at him directly. "What happens now?" Kyle asked. Rebecca shrugged. "You leave." Kyle blinked once. "This apartment's under my name, Kyle. You want me out today? I want this over." Kyle stared at her for several quiet seconds. Then he nodded once. No yelling, no begging. That seemed to irritate Rebecca more than anger would have. "You're seriously not going to say anything?" Kyle grabbed a black trash bag from under the sink. "What do you want me to say?" Rebecca opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the next 20 minutes, Kyle packed quietly. Work clothes, thermals, a pair of jeans, 2 hoodies, socks rolled tightly together the way his father taught him years ago. Rebecca stayed near the kitchen island, scrolling through her phone while pretending not to watch him. At one point she said, "You could at least fight for us a little." Kyle zipped the trash bag closed. "You already picked someone else." Rebecca looked away immediately. That told him enough. When Kyle entered the bedroom for the last time, he noticed Trevor's cologne lingering faintly near the dresser. He also noticed his own side of the closet had been cleared before he arrived home. Rebecca had planned this. That realization settled cold in his chest. Prepared, organized. Final. Kyle reached beneath the bed and pulled out an old metal lockbox. Rebecca glanced up sharply from the living room. What's in that old paperwork? You taking all the financial stuff? Kyle looked at her. We don't have financial stuff. Rebecca rolled her eyes. See that attitude right there? Kyle ignored her. Inside the lockbox sat a few documents, his late father's watch, and a sealed yellow envelope he had not opened in years. He placed everything carefully into the trash bag. At the front door, Rebecca finally stepped closer. So that's it. Kyle adjusted the bag over his shoulder. You made your decision. You're acting like I ruined your life. Kyle rested one hand on the doorknob. No, he said quietly. I think you already decided what my life was worth. For the first time that morning, Rebecca looked uncomfortable. Only briefly. Then the hardness returned. She pulled a folded stack of cash from her sweatshirt pocket and shoved it toward him. Here. Kyle looked down. 220s, $40, for gas or whatever. He stared at the bills without taking them. Rebecca sighed impatiently and tossed them toward him anyway. One bill fluttered against his boot before sliding across the floorboards. You'll land somewhere, she muttered. Somewhere. Not home. Kyle bent down slowly, picked up the money, and slid it into his pocket without another word. Then he walked out. The apartment door slammed behind him harder than necessary. 3 locks clicked shut. Deadbolt, chain, handle lock. Kyle stood motionless in the hallway while the sound echoed. Then came laughter. A man's laughter. Trevor had never actually left the building. Kyle closed his eyes once, not from heartbreak, from understanding. By the time he reached the parking lot, snow had thickened into heavy, wind-driven sheets that rattled across the truck hood. His phone battery showed 4%. No missed calls, no apology, no hesitation from Rebecca at all. Kyle threw the trash bag into the passenger seat and climbed behind the wheel. The heater coughed weakly before blowing lukewarm air that smelled faintly like dust. He drove for nearly an hour without direction. Downtown Denver faded behind him. Gas stations, overpasses, snow-covered strip malls. At 9:03 a.m., the low fuel light came on. Kyle pulled behind a King Soopers grocery store near Lakewood and parked beside a row of delivery trucks. He bought the cheapest coffee available and a microwaved breakfast burrito, using $9 from Rebecca's $40. The cashier barely looked at him. Back inside the truck, Kyle tried reclining the driver's seat. It barely moved. The cold seeped upward through the floorboards. His knees cramped against the steering wheel. Condensation gathered thickly on the inside windows. He reached into the trash bag for a hoodie and accidentally knocked loose the metal lockbox. The yellow envelope slid partly out. Kyle stared at it. His father's handwriting stretched across the front. For Kyle, when things get quiet enough to think. Outside, snow tapped softly against the windshield. Kyle opened the envelope carefully. A smaller, folded note fell into his lap, and beneath it his phone suddenly vibrated. Low battery warning. Then another notification appeared. Voicemail. Saved Daniel Long. 2 months before his father died. Kyle frowned slowly. He did not remember ever hearing it. The truck cabin stayed silent except for the ticking heater vents. Kyle pressed play. Static crackled softly through the truck speakers. Then Daniel Long's voice came through. Older, rougher than Kyle remembered. Slower between sentences. Hey, kid. Kyle froze instantly. Snow drifted sideways outside the windshield, while his father's voice filled the cramped truck cabin for the first time in almost 3 years. If you're hearing this, Daniel said, it probably means things got bad enough that you finally opened the envelope. Kyle lowered the phone slowly, lowered the phone. His father coughed hard somewhere in the recording. Metal clanged faintly in the background. Probably the old machine shop in Golden, where Daniel spent most of his life repairing industrial systems nobody else wanted to touch. Then came silence, long enough to feel intentional. Listen carefully, Daniel continued. Loud people rush decisions. Quiet people survive them. Kyle stared through the fogged windshield. His father kept talking. There's paperwork in that envelope. Don't throw any of it away. And don't trust anybody who suddenly starts acting supportive after you have something they want. Kyle swallowed once, another cough. You were always smarter than me, Kyle. You just never needed attention bad enough to prove it. The voicemail ended there. No goodbye. No dramatic final words. Just the soft click of disconnected audio. Kyle sat motionless for nearly a full minute. The heater vents rattled weakly beside his knee. Outside, a grocery cart rolled loose across the parking lot before slamming into a snowbank. Finally, Kyle unfolded the smaller handwritten note inside the envelope. The paper smelled faintly of oil and old cardboard. Kyle, if something happens to me, go see Ellen Mercer. Don't sign anything fast. Don't sell the rights cheap. And don't let shame make you stupid. Dad. Kyle frowned. Ellen Mercer. The name sounded familiar. He dug deeper into the envelope. Inside sat a thick stack of old documents clipped together with rusted binder clips, patent diagrams, licensing agreements, engineering sketches filled with measurements and handwritten annotations. Most were dated nearly 12 years earlier. Kyle flipped slowly through page after page. At the top of one document, bold lettering read, Thermal Failure Prediction and Building Sensor Array, Daniel Long and Howard Petrov, Engineering Solutions. Kyle stared at the title. He remembered pieces of this now. Late nights in the garage when he was younger. His father sketching diagrams at the kitchen table after 12-hour repair shifts. Talking about affordable monitoring systems for older commercial buildings. Back then, nobody cared about predictive maintenance technology. Most building owners only fixed problems after something exploded, flooded, or caught fire. Daniel used to complain about it constantly. Everybody pays for disasters, he once told Kyle. Nobody pays to prevent one. Kyle continued reading. Most of the paperwork was technical, but one section caught his attention immediately. Transfer of partial interest rights. Beneficiary Kyle Daniel Long, effective upon death of Daniel Long. Kyle blinked slowly. His father had transferred ownership rights to him years ago, and never told Rebecca, never mentioned it to anyone. Kyle leaned back against the driver's seat. For the first time since leaving the apartment, his breathing steadied slightly. Not because the documents guaranteed money. They didn't. Half the companies listed on the paperwork probably no longer existed. The patent itself might already be worthless. But the envelope changed something more important. Kyle realized his father had expected hard times long before they arrived, and prepared for them quietly. His phone battery dropped to 2%. Kyle grabbed the charging cable from the glove compartment. Dead. Of course. He stared at the battery symbol for a second, then started the truck engine again to conserve power. Gas needle hovered just above empty. Perfect. By noon, the snowstorm weakened into freezing rain. Kyle drove toward Golden with stiff shoulders and barely enough fuel left to risk the trip. The old industrial district near Colfax Avenue looked almost unchanged from childhood memories. Welding shops, auto yards, warehouses with faded signs and chain-link fences. Ellen Mercer's office sat inside a narrow brick building squeezed between a plumbing supplier and a tax preparation storefront. The gold lettering on the window read, Mercer Legal Consulting Estate Contract Business Litigation. Kyle hesitated before entering. The office smelled like paper files and burnt coffee. No music, no receptionist. A woman in her late 50s sat behind a desk stacked with organized folders. Silver-framed glasses. Dark blazer. Gray streaks through tightly pulled back hair. She looked up immediately. Kyle Long. Not a question. Kyle paused. You know who I am. Your father talked about you constantly. Ellen Mercer closed a file. You look exhausted. Kyle glanced down at his stained work jacket. Been a long night. I assumed. She gestured toward the chair across from her desk. Sit. Kyle placed the envelope carefully on the desk between them. Ellen's expression shifted the moment she saw Daniel's handwriting. You finally opened it. You knew about this. I helped draft most of it. Kyle sat back slowly. Ellen removed the patent paperwork from the envelope with precise movements. For the next 20 minutes, she reviewed documents silently, while Kyle watched snowfall melt down the office window. Finally, she removed her glasses. Your father was smarter than people gave him credit for. Kyle gave a tired half-nod. That sounds familiar. He and Howard Petroff developed this system before the market was ready for it. Ellen tapped one diagram lightly. Low-cost predictive monitoring for aging commercial infrastructure, boiler stress indicators, thermal pressure analytics. Cheap enough for older buildings that couldn't afford large engineering contracts. Did it ever make money? Not then. Kyle's stomach tightened slightly. But now Ellen continued, different story. She opened another folder from her desk drawer. 3 years ago, smart building technology exploded. Energy efficiency laws changed. Insurance companies started pressuring commercial properties to adopt predictive systems. Kyle frowned. You're saying this matters now. I'm saying parts of it might. Might. Not certainty, not fantasy. Just possibility. And somehow, that sounded more believable. Ellen leaned forward slightly. Did Rebecca know about any of this? Kyle looked toward the window. No good. The answer came sharp enough to surprise him. Ellen folded her hands. Listen carefully, Kyle. Right now you are emotionally vulnerable, financially unstable, and recently separated. Those 3 things together make people dangerous. Kyle stayed quiet. You do not talk publicly about these documents. You do not brag. You do not threaten your wife. You do not suddenly start acting important. I wasn't planning to. Good. Because if these rights hold value, the fastest way to lose leverage is emotional reaction. Kyle looked down at the paperwork again. His father's notes covered nearly every margin. Tiny corrections, material costs, sensor placements, even jokes scribbled beside failed calculations. For a moment, Kyle could almost see him sitting at the old garage table again under fluorescent lights. Ellen interrupted the silence. Where are you staying? Kyle hesitated. In my truck right now. She studied him for 2 long seconds without pity. Then she opened a drawer and slid a business card across the desk. Call this number. Friend of mine rents furnished rooms month to month near Lakewood. Cheap. Clean enough. Kyle took the card carefully. Thank you. Ellen nodded once. Then her eyes hardened slightly. One more thing. Kyle looked up. If Rebecca suddenly becomes kind again, document everything. Kyle frowned faintly. You think she will? Ellen slid the patent paperwork back into the envelope. I think people who underestimate quiet men usually come back once silence starts looking expensive. Outside, freezing rain tapped softly against the office windows. Kyle looked down at the envelope in his hands. For the first time since the apartment door slammed behind him, he no longer felt homeless. Not safe, not successful, but positioned. And those were 2 very different things. The room above the laundromat measured maybe 200 square feet. 1 narrow bed, 1 metal lamp, a mini refrigerator that rattled every 20 minutes like it was trying to survive 1 more winter. The carpet smelled faintly of detergent and old cigarettes, no matter how often Kyle opened the window. But it had a lock on the door. And it was warm. For the first week, that was enough. The building sat on West Colfax, near Lakewood, wedged between a pawn shop and a Mexican restaurant with flickering neon signs. Downstairs, industrial washing machines shook the ceiling from 6 in the morning until midnight. Kyle barely noticed anymore. His days became mechanical. Work, drive, study, sleep, repeat. At 5:10 every evening, he left the laundromat carrying the same black backpack and thermos of coffee. He drove downtown in the Ford Ranger, with the heater still failing whenever temperatures dropped below freezing. Pike and Rowe Tower looked different to him now. Not emotionally, structurally. For years, Kyle had walked through the building like a laborer trying not to attract attention. Now he observed it differently. Pressure systems, weak infrastructure, aging mechanical sequences hidden beneath polished marble lobbies. The building spoke constantly if someone knew how to listen. Most people didn't. At 6:00 p.m., Kyle clocked in beside two other maintenance workers in the basement operations room. Miguel Alvarez glanced toward him while tightening bolts on a tool case. "You look less dead this week." Kyle almost smiled. Improvement. Miguel nodded toward the coffee machine. "Apartment situation better. Got a room now. Good." That was the entire conversation. Kyle appreciated people who understood silence. By midnight, he had already repaired a damaged cooling valve on the 22nd floor, reset two malfunctioning electrical panels, and hauled replacement filters through freezing rooftop wind that cut through his gloves. At 2:13 a.m., while most of Denver slept, Kyle sat alone inside Boiler Room C, reviewing online engineering certification modules on his phone during break. Thermal pressure mapping, failure prediction systems, commercial sensor integration. Most nights he studied until his eyes blurred, not because someone demanded it, because motion felt safer than collapse. At 4:40 a.m., after clocking out, Kyle drove directly across town to weekend HVAC service calls, arranged through a small contractor named Pete Garrison. Pete owned a struggling repair business and hired Kyle under the table for emergency jobs. The pay was terrible. The work was worse. But Kyle never turned shifts down. One Saturday morning, Pete handed him a clipboard outside a failed heating system in Arvada. "You ever sleep?" Kyle checked the pressure gauge. "Sometimes." Pete snorted. "You remind me of prison documentaries." Kyle crouched beside the damaged furnace unit, comforting comparison. Pete watched him work for a moment. "You know," he said casually, "most guys going through divorce stuff start drinking themselves stupid." Kyle loosened a rusted fitting carefully. "Seems expensive." Pete laughed hard enough to cough. That became another pattern. People kept expecting Kyle to break loudly. Instead, he became quieter, sharper, more organized. The black notebook appeared during the second month. Simple spiral binding, dark cover. Small enough to fit inside his jacket pocket, Kyle wrote everything down. Dates, expenses, conversations, bank balances, work hours. Every text Rebecca sent, especially those. Some messages arrived late at night. "You still haven't signed the papers. Don't drag this out. Trevor thinks you're doing this to stay connected to me." Kyle never corrected the spelling mistake in Trevor's name. He simply documented it. Another text arrived 3 days later. "You left some old tools here. If you don't pick them up, I'm throwing them out." Kyle responded exactly once. "I'll collect them Saturday at 10 a.m. No emotion, no accusations." Rebecca answered immediately. "Wow, still cold as ever?" Kyle closed the notebook after writing the exchange down. Cold. Interesting word. He remembered sleeping in his truck with frozen condensation on the windows, while Rebecca laughed with Trevor upstairs. People often confused emotional control with emotional absence. By early spring, Kyle's schedule bordered on insane. Maintenance shifts downtown, HVAC side jobs, online coursework between jobs, 4 hours of sleep on good nights, sometimes less. His shoulders constantly hurt. The skin around his knuckles cracked from chemical cleaners and cold rooftop air. He lost nearly 15 pounds in 3 months, but slowly something else happened too. His thinking sharpened. One Tuesday night, Pike and Rowe experienced another pressure fluctuation inside its aging heating network. Engineers from a consulting firm blamed faulty valves and recommended a complete replacement system that would cost nearly $400,000. Kyle read the report during lunch. Half of it was wrong. Not maliciously wrong, carelessly wrong. At 1:20 a.m., he sat alone in the basement mechanical room, studying old sensor outputs on a dusty monitor while steam pipes rattled overhead. The pressure spikes followed patterns, not random ones, sequences. Kyle pulled out his notebook. Then another. Then old diagrams copied from Daniel Long's envelope. For the next 2 hours, he sketched calculations across loose paper towels and maintenance forms, while cold coffee sat untouched beside him. Heat distribution lag, delayed pressure compensation, fault timing. A cheaper sensor relay could predict the failures before escalation. Not perfectly, but enough. Kyle stared at the diagrams. His father had been right. Nobody wanted prevention because prevention looked invisible. At 3:08 a.m., Kyle stopped writing suddenly. A realization hit him hard enough to make him sit back. The old system could be redesigned, simplified, modernized, cheaper, not theoretical, practical. His pulse quickened for the first time in months, not from anger, from focus. The next morning, Kyle returned to the laundromat room carrying photocopies and engineering notes stuffed inside a grocery bag. The room smelled like bleach and hot detergent drifting upward through the vents. He spread the papers across the bed carefully. Then he worked, for hours, sketching, recalculating, researching component costs online. By sunset, the tiny room looked like a war table covered in diagrams and handwritten formulas. Kyle barely noticed darkness falling outside, until his phone buzzed. Rebecca. He let it ring twice before answering. What, you sound tired? Kyle leaned back in the chair slowly. I am. Rebecca hesitated briefly. That was new. I talked to Trevor, she said. He thinks we should settle the divorce faster. Kyle stared at the ceiling water stains. I'm reviewing everything. You don't need a lawyer for this. Actually, he already had one. Rebecca continued before he could answer. You're making things difficult for no reason. Kyle reached for the notebook automatically. Date, time, call duration. What exactly is difficult? He asked calmly. A pause. Then Rebecca sighed dramatically. This version of you. Kyle waited. You act like you're smarter than everyone suddenly. The statement almost amused him. Kyle looked around the tiny room above the laundromat. Second-hand blankets, instant noodles stacked beside the microwave. Work boots drying near the heater vent. Nothing about his life looked powerful. But internally, something had changed. Not confidence. Structure. He finally understood that panic made people predictable. Preparation made them dangerous. Rebecca snapped. I'm here. You know Trevor could help you find better work if you stopped being stubborn. There it was again. Trevor. Always inserted carefully into conversations like a salesman placing products on a shelf. Kyle wrote another line in the notebook. Then he closed it. I have to sleep, he said quietly. Before Rebecca could answer, he ended the call. The laundromat dryers thundered below the floorboards. Outside the small window, snowmelt dripped steadily from broken gutters. Kyle turned back toward the diagrams spread across the bed, and for the first time since losing everything, he stopped thinking about survival. He started thinking about leverage. The storm hit Denver on a Thursday night in late November. By 8:40 p.m., freezing rain coated downtown streets in reflective ice, while wind slammed against the glass exterior of Pike Rowe Tower, hard enough to make the upper floors groan faintly. Kyle noticed the pressure imbalance before the alarms triggered. That was the difference between technicians and people who only read reports. At 9:12 p.m., he stood inside Mechanical Control Room B, reviewing temperature fluctuations across the heating network. Tiny inconsistencies blinked across the monitor. Boiler 3 lagging. Pressure compensation delayed by 7 seconds. Then 9. Then 12. Kyle straightened slowly. Not good. Miguel walked in carrying a flashlight. Lobby's already complaining about cold air. Kyle kept staring at the monitor. Tell security not to shut off any auxiliary systems. Miguel frowned. You think it's serious? Kyle grabbed his radio. I think we're early. 3 minutes later, Boiler 3 failed. The sound hit through the walls first, a deep metallic concussion. Then alarms exploded across the control room all at once. Red warning lights flashed overhead. Pressure spikes surged through the monitoring screens, while emergency notifications rolled across the display panels. Miguel swore immediately. Jesus Christ, Kyle was already moving. Call engineering support. They're 40 minutes out in this weather. Then we don't have 40 minutes. The tower housed nearly 900 people that night. Attorneys, hotel guests, corporate conference attendees. A charity event filled the 32nd floor ballroom. If the system overheated completely, pipes could burst through multiple floors. Flooding, electrical failures, possible evacuation. Kyle sprinted through the service corridor carrying a portable diagnostic kit, while emergency alarms echoed across the building. Cold air rushed through the vents now. Wrong kind of cold. Mechanical failure cold. By the time he reached the lower boiler chamber, steam already hissed violently from a pressure bypass valve. Kyle crouched beside the control panel immediately. The automated compensation sequence wasn't responding fast enough. Exactly like the patterns he'd studied for months, his eyes narrowed. Not enough sensor feedback. The system was reacting after overload instead of before it. Miguel's voice crackled through the radio. Tenants are panicking upstairs. Kyle ignored the noise around him. His mind moved differently during emergencies. Calmer, cleaner. He ripped open the diagnostic case and started wiring temporary relay sensors directly into the pressure lines. Miguel stared. What are you doing buying time? That setup isn't approved. Neither is a boiler explosion. Kyle's hands moved fast. Years of overnight repair work had trained him for this kind of pressure. Tight spaces, noise, limited options. The temporary relay system wasn't elegant. It wasn't even technically company protocol. But Kyle knew something the consultants didn't. Older buildings rarely failed from one catastrophic mistake. They failed from delayed reactions stacking together. Steam pressure screamed through the pipes again. Kyle adjusted the sensor calibration manually. Then he bypassed the automated delay threshold. The readings stabilized slightly. Not fixed, but slowing. Miguel stared at the monitor. Pressure's dropping. Not enough. Kyle grabbed another cable. He connected the temporary relay directly into the secondary monitoring system, using a stripped maintenance tablet balanced on top of a toolbox. The screen flickered, then updated. Real-time response speeds improved instantly. Miguel blinked. What the hell is that Kyle didn't look up? A faster prediction loop. You built this parts of it. Another violent shudder rolled through the boiler chamber. Then silence. Not total silence. Operational silence. The dangerous kind of silence after systems stop escalating. The pressure numbers finally stabilized. Slowly, carefully. Holding. Miguel exhaled, hard enough to laugh. No damn way. Kyle leaned back against the concrete wall, breathing heavily for the first time in nearly 20 minutes. Sweat soaked through the back of his shirt despite the freezing air. Emergency engineering crews arrived 27 minutes later. By then, Kyle's temporary relay network had already prevented the full overload sequence. The chief engineer spent 10 minutes studying the setup in visible confusion. Who authorized this? Nobody answered immediately. Finally, Miguel pointed toward Kyle. He did. The engineer looked irritated, then impressed. Then irritated again. Why weren't these response relays already integrated into the system? Kyle wiped grease across his sleeve. Because nobody asked maintenance guys. That line traveled through the building faster than the storm itself. By morning, senior management wanted reports. By noon, the conference organizers sent formal thank you emails. By evening, Pike and Rowe executives were reviewing footage from the mechanical rooms. Kyle tried avoiding attention. He failed. The following Monday, his supervisor stopped him near the freight elevators. "Operations executive wants to see you upstairs." Kyle frowned slightly. "Why? Apparently you prevented a $6 million disaster." Kyle adjusted the tool bag on his shoulder. "Feels exaggerated. Not to accounting." The executive offices occupied the 36th floor. Different world entirely. Glass walls, silent carpeting, coffee machines that probably cost more than Kyle's truck. A receptionist escorted him into a conference room overlooking downtown Denver, buried beneath fresh snow. A woman stood near the windows, studying a tablet. Mid-40s maybe. Dark tailored suit, controlled posture, no unnecessary movement. Dana Whitaker, Regional Operations Director for Whitaker Property Systems. Kyle recognized the name immediately. Her company managed nearly 20 commercial properties across Colorado. She turned toward him calmly. "You're Kyle Long." "Yes, ma'am." Dana gestured toward the chair across from her. "Sit." Kyle remained standing for half a second longer than necessary before obeying. Dana slid several printed diagrams across the table. His diagrams, the temporary relay modifications. Kyle's stomach tightened slightly. "I can explain I already reviewed the incident reports," Dana interrupted. "I'm not here to discipline you." Kyle stopped talking. Dana tapped the diagrams lightly. "These pressure prediction sequences, did you design them yourself?" Kyle hesitated carefully. "Modified older concepts, from where my father worked on similar systems years ago." Dana studied him for a long moment. "Why are you working overnight maintenance shifts instead of engineering design?" Simple question. Complicated answer. Kyle looked toward the snowy skyline outside. Life moved differently than expected. Dana nodded once like she understood more than she said. Then she opened another file. "These consultants recommended replacing half the system for $400,000. She looked up. "Your temporary network stabilized it using under $3,000 in relay hardware." Kyle stayed quiet. Dana leaned back slightly. "You understand what predictive infrastructure technology is worth right now?" "Somewhat." "No," Dana said calmly. "I don't think you do." The room fell silent. Some executives filled silence with intimidation. Dana used it for evaluation. Finally, she spoke again. "How much formal engineering education do you have?" "Not enough." That wasn't the question. Kyle folded his hands carefully. 2 years community college before I dropped out to help my father. And the rest, work. Dana almost smiled at that. Almost. She stood and walked toward the window overlooking downtown traffic. "When I was 28, she said quietly, I had executives dismiss me for 6 straight years because I came from facilities operations instead of finance." Kyle listened silently. Dana turned back toward him. "Buildings reveal who actually understands systems under pressure." She tapped his diagrams again. "You understand systems." Kyle looked down at the papers. "I understand old buildings. Same thing." Dana returned to her seat. Then she slid a business card across the table. "Whitaker Infrastructure Technologies. Direct number handwritten on the back. I'd like you to meet with one of our engineering review teams." Kyle stared at the card. "For what?" "To see whether your ideas scale." Kyle exhaled slowly. People like Dana Whitaker didn't casually invite maintenance workers into development meetings, which meant one of two things. Either she saw potential or she saw leverage, possibly both. Dana watched him carefully. "You don't seem excited." Kyle considered the question honestly. "I'm trying to figure out the angle." That finally made her smile slightly. "Good," she said. "That means you're probably ready for bigger rooms." When Kyle left the 36th floor, the city looked different somehow. Not richer, not kinder. Just more open than it had 1 week earlier. Downstairs in the maintenance office, Miguel looked up immediately. Well? Kyle tucked Dana's card into his jacket pocket. They want another meeting. Miguel grinned. Told you. Quiet guys always scare people once they stop struggling. Kyle sat down slowly beside the old boiler monitors. His phone buzzed once. Unknown number. Then a text appeared. Saw your name online. Didn't know you were suddenly important. Rebecca Kyle stared at the message for several seconds. Then he opened the black notebook and wrote down the exact time. Rebecca chose the diner carefully. Kyle noticed that immediately. Not downtown where people from Pike and Rowe might recognize him now. Not Cherry Creek where Rebecca's friends spent weekends posting cocktail photos online. Instead, she picked a small 24-hour diner off Colorado Boulevard with cracked leather booths and laminated menus stained at the corners from years of coffee spills. Neutral territory. Controlled lighting. Public enough to look harmless. Private enough to negotiate. Kyle arrived 11 minutes early. Habit. He parked the Ford Ranger near the far edge of the lot, beside a snowbank darkened by old exhaust stains. Inside, the diner smelled like bacon grease-burnt coffee and floor cleaner. Rebecca was already there. That surprised him. She sat in a corner booth wearing a cream-colored wool coat Kyle had never seen before. Gold earrings, hair carefully styled, phone face down on the table beside untouched coffee, prepared. Everything about Rebecca looked prepared lately. When Kyle approached, she smiled softly, not warmly, strategically. Hey! Kyle slid into the booth across from her. Hi. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Waitresses moved between tables carrying plates of hash browns and coffee refills, while an old country song played quietly through ceiling speakers. Rebecca studied him carefully. You lost weight. Kyle shrugged once, working more. You look different. That part was true. Not physically. Still the same quiet face. Same rough hands. Same steady posture. But the hesitation was gone. Rebecca noticed it immediately. A waitress appeared with menus. Kyle ordered black coffee only. Rebecca tilted her head slightly after the waitress left. You used to get pancakes here. Kyle looked toward the window. That was a while ago. Another small silence. Rebecca finally folded her hands together. I'm glad you came. You asked. That doesn't mean you had to. Kyle didn't answer. Rebecca exhaled slowly like she had practiced this conversation in advance. Look, she said quietly. Things got ugly between us. Kyle almost smiled at the understatement. Ugly. Interesting word for homelessness. For $40 tossed across apartment flooring, for hearing another man laugh behind a locked door, Rebecca continued before he could respond. I know you probably hate me. I don't. That answer visibly unsettled her. Rebecca blinked once. You don't? Kyle stirred sugar into his coffee he didn't actually want sweetened. Hate takes energy. Rebecca leaned back slightly. That sounds like something your dad used to say. Kyle's hand paused briefly against the mug. Rebecca noticed. Of course she did. She always noticed emotional openings once she needed something. I heard about the storm incident, she said casually. The building thing. Kyle remained expressionless. Small article online. It wasn't important. Apparently, it was. The waitress returned with coffee refills. Rebecca waited until she walked away before speaking again. Trevor said your name's coming up around commercial property groups now. There it was. Not concern. Research. Kyle took a slow sip of coffee. Trevor follows maintenance industry news. Rebecca smiled faintly. You know what I mean. Kyle did. She wasn't asking about him. She was measuring value. Again. Rebecca leaned forward slightly. I just think maybe we stopped seeing each other clearly. Kyle looked at her for the first time since sitting down. What does that mean? Her voice softened instantly. It means maybe we both got frustrated. Maybe we both said things we regret. Interesting. Not I regret throwing you out. Not I regret cheating. Both equal distribution. Kyle noticed every word choice carefully now. Rebecca reached toward his hand across the table, but stopped short when he didn't move. You disappeared emotionally a long time before we split. Kyle stared at her quietly. The statement would have worked better on someone desperate to defend himself. Instead, he simply asked, "Did Trevor tell you to say that?" Rebecca's jaw tightened. There it is. What that attitude? She sat back again. Like everyone's manipulating you. Kyle said nothing, because she was. Rebecca sighed dramatically and looked toward the diner windows. You know, Trevor actually said you were smarter than people realized. Kyle nearly laughed at that. Trevor Hale, the same man who drank coffee from Kyle's mug while sleeping with his wife. Now suddenly respectful. Convenient timing. Rebecca continued carefully. He thinks maybe we handled everything too fast. Kyle opened the black notebook inside his jacket pocket beneath the table. Not obviously, just enough. Date, time, location. Rebecca requesting reconciliation discussion. Then he closed it again. Rebecca noticed the movement. What's that work notes? Another lie she didn't challenge because she wanted the conversation moving elsewhere. Smart. Rebecca lowered her voice slightly. I know we're separated legally right now, but technically nothing's finalized. Kyle watched steam rise from the coffee mug. That's usually how divorce works. You know what I mean. Yes, he did. Rebecca tilted her head carefully. If your projects become something bigger. There it was. Finally. Not emotional, financial. Then obviously we should discuss what's fair. Kyle leaned back slowly. What projects? The sensor systems? He remained still. Rebecca continued too quickly. Trevor knows people in commercial development. He said predictive maintenance tech is becoming huge right now. Kyle noticed something important then. Rebecca still didn't understand the work itself, only the possibilities surrounding it. To her, the technology wasn't engineering. It was status, money, future leverage. Kyle folded his hands calmly on the table. You seem very informed suddenly. Rebecca forced a small laugh. I'm trying to understand your world better. No. She was trying to estimate it. There was a difference. Outside, freezing rain streaked across the diner windows, while headlights smeared across wet pavement. Rebecca lowered her voice again. I supported you for years, Kyle. The sentence arrived gently, almost sympathetic, but Kyle heard the structure underneath it immediately. Foundation for future claims. Shared sacrifice. Joint investment. He remembered sleeping in his truck behind King Soopers while she locked 3 deadbolts behind him. Supported. Interesting revision of history. Kyle kept his tone neutral. You threw me out. Rebecca's expression hardened instantly before softening again. That's not fair. Kyle looked at her steadily. No. She crossed her arms. You make everything sound colder than it was. Because facts sounded colder than excuses. Rebecca leaned forward again. You know what your problem is? Kyle waited. You never fight for anything emotionally. You just retreat inside yourself. Kyle thought about the months after leaving, working until his hands split open, studying in boiler rooms at 3 a.m, sleeping above a laundromat while rebuilding his entire life from $40 and a trash bag. Retreat. Interesting word. The waitress brought the check. Rebecca reached for it automatically. Kyle paid before she could touch it. Another thing she noticed. His hands no longer hesitated around money. Not because he had much, because he tracked all of it. Outside the diner, cold wind cut through the parking lot. Rebecca walked beside him toward the trucks. Trevor's influence lingered around her now. Better clothes, better posture. But something underneath looked strained. Fatigue around the eyes, Subtle tension in the jaw. Kyle noticed that too. She stopped beside his Ranger. "You still drive this thing, it works." Rebecca stared at him for several quiet seconds. Then she asked the real question. "How much are those systems worth?" Kyle almost admired the directness. Almost. "No idea." "You expect me to believe that?" "I don't really care what you believe." That landed harder than anger would have. Rebecca's face tightened slightly. "You know," she said quietly, "Trevor's dealt with business litigation before." Kyle opened the truck door. "Good for Trevor. I'm serious." "So am I." Rebecca stepped closer. "If this becomes complicated legally, you don't want people against you." Kyle finally looked directly at her again. Snowflakes drifted through the parking lot lights between them. "You already were against me." Rebecca opened her mouth. Nothing came out immediately. For one brief second, Kyle thought she might actually apologize. Instead, she said, "You're not the only person who knows how systems work now." Kyle nodded once, then climbed into the truck. Rebecca stood motionless beside the parking lot while the Ranger engine coughed to life. As Kyle pulled away, he glanced once in the rearview mirror. Rebecca remained standing under the diner sign with her arms folded tightly against the cold, watching him leave. Not like someone losing a husband, like someone recalculating an investment. The divorce petition arrived on a Wednesday morning, folded inside a certified envelope stamped by Denver County Court. Kyle found it hanging halfway out of the laundromat mailbox beside grocery store coupons and utility advertisements. Outside, freezing wind pushed dirty snow through the parking lot, while dryers thundered below the floorboards upstairs. He already knew Rebecca would escalate eventually. People like Trevor Hale rarely tolerated uncertainty. Kyle carried the envelope upstairs, set it carefully beside the microwave, then washed his hands before opening it. Habit again. Controlled movements before bad news. The paperwork was thick. Too thick for a normal separation filing. Kyle sat at the small table near the window and began reading. Rebecca claimed Kyle abandoned the marital residence voluntarily. Kyle concealed developing business interests during separation. Kyle intentionally withheld financial disclosures. Kyle possessed undisclosed intellectual property assets potentially subject to marital division. Kyle reread the last sentence twice, then once more. Not because it surprised him, because it confirmed something. Rebecca had not discovered the patent paperwork alone. Trevor had gone digging. Kyle reached for the black notebook immediately. Date, time, contents of filing. Then he grabbed his phone and called Evelyn Mercer. She answered on the second ring. "You sound calm," she said immediately. "I just got the petition. Good. Calm is useful." Kyle almost smiled faintly. "You expected this. I expected pressure tactics." Papers shuffled faintly on her end. "How aggressive are they?" Kyle read several sections aloud. Silence followed. Then Evelyn laughed once. Not amusement, recognition. "Trevor wrote parts of this. You can tell commercial litigation language inside a domestic filing usually means outside influence." Kyle looked down at the paperwork again. "They're mentioning concealed assets." "Yes," Evelyn said, "which means they're fishing. For what? For leverage before they actually understand what exists." Kyle leaned back in the chair slowly. The laundromat dryers rattled beneath the floor again. "So what happens now?" Now Evelyn said calmly, "We build the timeline properly." 2 days later, Kyle sat inside Evelyn Mercer's office, surrounded by stacked folders and highlighted documents. The room looked exactly the same as before. Minimal decoration, no wasted movement. Evelyn wore reading glasses low on her nose while reviewing bank statements. "Let's simplify this," she said. "Rebecca's filing depends on 3 claims." Kyle listened quietly. "She says you abandoned the residence voluntarily. False." Evelyn slid printed screenshots across the desk. Rebecca's texts. "You need to leave. This apartment is mine. Don't come back tonight." Kyle had preserved everything: dates, timestamps, cloud backups, even metadata. Evelyn tapped the pages lightly. These establish forced removal from the residence. Kyle nodded once. She also claims hidden financial development during marriage. Evelyn opened another folder. But Keller Grid concepts didn't legally evolve into active commercial discussions until after separation. Kyle frowned slightly. We don't even have a company. Doesn't matter. Evelyn adjusted the papers carefully. Intent matters legally. Timelines matter more. Kyle watched her organize evidence with surgical precision. No emotion, only sequence, Evelyn continued. And then we have the debt issue. That part surprised him. What debt issue? Evelyn slid another statement across the desk. Joint credit card account. Kyle stared at the numbers. Luxury hotel charges, furniture purchases, restaurant bills. Nearly $11,000 accumulated after he left the apartment. His jaw tightened slightly for the first time that meeting. She kept using the account. She increased spending after separation, Evelyn corrected calmly. Kyle stared at the charges again. One hotel appeared repeatedly. The Magnolia Hotel downtown. Trevor probably preferred expensive rooms to his own apartment. Evelyn noticed Kyle's expression immediately. Stay focused. Kyle exhaled slowly. She's spending money we don't have while claiming I hid assets. Exactly. Evelyn removed her glasses. That contradiction matters. Kyle rubbed tired fingers across his forehead. For months he had worked himself nearly numb trying to survive. Meanwhile, Rebecca and Trevor were already building legal angles around money that technically did not even exist yet. It would have felt insane if Kyle had not already started expecting it. Evelyn stood and walked toward a filing cabinet. When people panic financially, she said they become impatient. Impatient people create records. She handed Kyle another packet. Phone records, transaction timelines, property access logs from the apartment complex. Kyle frowned. What's this? You said. Trevor's vehicle stayed overnight, repeatedly, before separation became official. Kyle nodded slowly. I requested parking security footage preservation. Kyle stared at her. You can do that. I can do many things when clients document properly. For the first time in weeks, Kyle felt something dangerous creeping upward beneath his calm. Not rage, advantage. Evelyn returned to her chair. Now listen carefully, Kyle. From this point forward, every interaction matters. I know, no. Her voice sharpened slightly. You understand emotionally. I need you to understand legally. Kyle stayed silent. Evelyn folded her hands. You do not insult Rebecca in writing. You do not threaten Trevor. You do not discuss future technology development casually with anyone. Kyle nodded once. And one more thing. What? If Rebecca suddenly becomes emotional again, it's probably strategic. Kyle looked toward the office windows. She already tried. She'll escalate. That prediction arrived faster than expected. 3 nights later, Kyle exited Pike and Rowe after another 14-hour shift and found Trevor Hale leaning against the Ranger in the employee parking garage. Expensive charcoal coat, hands in pockets, confident posture carefully arranged for intimidation. Kyle stopped walking immediately. Trevor smiled faintly. Relax, just talking. Kyle kept several feet between them. You shouldn't touch my truck. Trevor ignored the comment. Rebecca says you're making the divorce difficult. Kyle unlocked the truck remotely without looking away from him. Rebecca threw me out. Trevor shrugged. Marriages end. Then why are you here? Trevor smiled wider at that. Because business gets complicated when emotions get involved. There it was again. Not husband, not man. Business? Kyle noticed Trevor always framed people as transactions eventually. Trevor stepped closer. You've got interesting ideas floating around now. He nodded toward Pike and Rowe Tower behind them. Word spreads. Kyle remained expressionless. Do you need something? Actually, I'm trying to help you. Kyle almost laughed. Trevor continued smoothly. You're not a corporate guy, Kyle. No offense. Guys like you build something smart, then get eaten alive legally because they trust the wrong people. Kyle opened the truck door slowly. Good night, Trevor. Trevor's smile faded slightly. You know Rebecca supported you for years. Kyle looked at him then, really looked at him. Trevor carried himself like someone accustomed to winning through confidence alone. Loud certainty, aggressive posture, expensive watch visible beneath coat sleeves. But his eyes moved too much, scanning constantly, calculating reactions. Kyle recognized the type now. Men who mistook pressure for power. You stayed in my apartment while I was still paying utilities, Kyle said quietly. Trevor's expression shifted. Barely. You don't know what Rebecca told me. No, Kyle agreed. I know what happened. The silence stretched cold between them. Finally, Trevor adjusted his coat. You should settle before things become expensive. Kyle closed the truck door again instead of entering. Then he asked the question carefully. How many lawsuits are you dealing with right now? Trevor blinked once. Unexpected. There it was. Kyle saw it immediately. Tiny hesitation. Trevor recovered fast. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Kyle climbed into the truck. Trevor stood motionless beside the driver window. You think you're smarter than everyone, suddenly because one executive talked to you? Kyle started the engine. No, he said calmly. I think patient people notice things loud people miss. Trevor's jaw tightened. Finally, a real reaction. Kyle drove away without another word. Back upstairs in the laundromat room later that night, he opened the notebook again. Every detail. Parking garage encounter. Trevor mentioning settlement pressure. References to business exposure. Possible intimidation attempt. Then Kyle stopped writing suddenly. One sentence from the divorce filing replayed in his head. Undisclosed intellectual property assets. Not patents, not systems, assets. Meaning Trevor believed the technology already carried market value, which meant someone had been researching it seriously. Kyle leaned back slowly in the chair. Outside the window, freezing rain slid down the glass while Denver traffic blurred red and white beneath streetlights. For months, Kyle had focused only on rebuilding. Now he understood something else. Trevor and Rebecca were no longer reacting emotionally. They were positioning financially. And people only positioned that aggressively when they believed something valuable was close. 3 years changed Kyle Long slowly, not all at once, not with lottery money or viral success or some dramatic overnight transformation people could post online beside motivational quotes. The changes came in layers. Paperwork first, then systems, then leverage, then silence from people who used to laugh at him. Keller Grid Systems officially existed 18 months after the storm incident at Pike Rowe Tower. The company started inside a rented office, no larger than a dentist waiting room near downtown Denver. 4 folding desks, 2 refurbished monitors, a coffee maker that leaked constantly onto the counter. Kyle still worked maintenance shifts during the first year. Dana Whitaker insisted he stop. Kyle refused. Not until the contracts stabilize. Dana studied him across conference tables, sometimes like he was a man from another decade. Most founders chased appearance before structure. Kyle built the opposite way. Every dollar entering Keller Grid got documented. Every test sequence verified. Every investor screened through Evelyn Mercer before meetings even happened. Dana respected that immediately. You know what usually kills small infrastructure companies? She asked during one late-night strategy meeting. Kyle looked up from system projections, cash flow ego. Kyle almost smiled faintly. The office windows reflected downtown Denver beneath cold winter rain, while engineers worked quietly in nearby cubicles. Keller Grid's software was not glamorous, no flashy consumer branding, no social media hype. The system predicted maintenance failures in aging commercial buildings before catastrophic breakdowns happened. Boilers, cooling systems, pressure networks, electrical overload patterns. Insurance companies loved it because prevention saved lawsuits. Property managers loved it because repairs became cheaper. Old maintenance workers loved it because finally someone built technology that understood real buildings instead of theoretical models. Kyle insisted on one rule from the beginning. Every system had to remain usable by ordinary technicians. Don't build software for executives, he told developers repeatedly. Build it for the guy freezing on the roof at 2 a.m. trying to stop a pipe from bursting. That line eventually became company culture. 2 years after launch, Keller Grid monitored 17 commercial properties across Colorado. 3 years after launch, they expanded into Arizona and Utah. By then, Kyle technically qualified as wealthy. Nobody would have guessed it. He still drove the old Ford Ranger, still wore plain dark jackets, still carried tools himself during field inspections. Dana once watched him spend 30 minutes helping a maintenance apprentice replace a damaged circulation valve personally. Afterward, she stood beside him near the loading dock. You realize CEOs usually delegate that. Kyle wiped grease from his hands. Valve didn't care who owned the company. Dana laughed once. That became another difference between them. Dana understood business systems instinctively. Kyle understood operational systems instinctively. Together, the combination worked, quietly, efficiently, dangerously. Meanwhile, Trevor Hale's life began cracking at the edges. Kyle learned this gradually through public records first, missed contract deadlines, civil complaints, supplier disputes, nothing catastrophic individually. But patterns mattered. Kyle always watched patterns. Trevor's company expanded too aggressively during Denver's commercial boom. Luxury developments, high-risk financing, overpromised construction schedules. The kind of business model that looked impressive right before collapse. Rebecca stayed with him anyway, at least publicly. Kyle occasionally saw glimpses online. Vacation photos in Scottsdale, cocktail bars, designer handbags, forced smiles. But the details underneath changed. Different apartments every few months, smaller vacations, more filtered images, less certainty in Rebecca's posture. Kyle noticed because he had once memorized her expressions better than anyone alive. Now he observed them like evidence. One snowy January morning, Keller Grid finalized its largest contract yet. Whitmore Financial Plaza, 31 floors downtown, full predictive infrastructure integration. Dana entered Kyle's office carrying the signed agreement, $8 million over 5 years. Kyle reviewed the numbers carefully instead of celebrating. Dana leaned against the doorway. You know, normal people would react emotionally to this. Kyle signed the final page. System still has deployment risks. Dana shook her head slowly. Sometimes I genuinely can't tell if you're calm or psychologically damaged. Kyle looked up briefly. Probably both. That actually made her laugh. The new Keller Grid headquarters opened 6 months later. 4-story brick building near downtown Denver with renovated interiors and exposed industrial piping. Kyle specifically requested remain visible. Why keep the pipes exposed, one architect asked during renovations, so nobody forgets what actually keeps buildings alive. The lobby walls displayed no flashy corporate slogans, only one line engraved behind reception: failures leave patterns before they become disasters. Most visitors assumed it referred to infrastructure systems. Kyle knew better. The company grew to 42 employees by the 3rd year. Many came from backgrounds similar to his: former technicians, night shift operators, people ignored by polished corporate recruiters because their hands looked too rough, or their resumes lacked expensive schools. Kyle hired based on reliability, not performance theater. One afternoon, Miguel Alvarez walked through Keller Grid headquarters carrying donuts while staring around in disbelief. "You know this is insane, right?" Kyle looked up from engineering reports. "What part you own this building? Bank partially owns it." Miguel snorted. "Still counts." Kyle handed him coffee. Miguel wandered toward the operations floor windows, overlooking downtown traffic. "You remember sleeping in that truck outside Pike Rowe?" Kyle did. Every detail. Frozen windows, dead heater, $40. Miguel shook his head slowly. Crazy. Kyle remained quiet, because the truck still existed, still parked downstairs, still running badly during cold mornings. Some things he refused to replace too quickly. Success felt dangerous when people forgot discomfort too fast. Late one evening, Kyle exited the headquarters after 14 straight hours, reviewing installation projections for a Phoenix contract. Snow drifted softly across downtown sidewalks. Most employees had already left. The street looked empty except for one figure standing across from the building beneath a glowing parking garage light. A woman. Still. Watching. Kyle paused near the entrance doors. Recognition arrived immediately. Rebecca. Even from a distance, he noticed changes. The expensive coat looked newer than the woman wearing it. Her posture remained polished, but exhaustion hid beneath it now. The kind of exhaustion people carried after spending years pretending things were still under control. Kyle did not walk toward her immediately. Instead, he stood inside the glass lobby for several seconds, watching reflections move across the windows. 3 years earlier, she threw him out carrying a trash bag. Now she stood outside a building with his company name across the entrance. Strange symmetry. Rebecca finally noticed him through the glass. Their eyes met. For a moment, neither moved. Then she smiled carefully, not warmly, nervously. Kyle stepped outside into the cold. Rebecca folded her arms against the wind. "You look successful?" Kyle glanced toward the street. "It's cold out here. That's your first response. It's snowing." Rebecca laughed softly, but tension sat underneath it. Kyle noticed immediately. Something was wrong. Not dramatic. Financial, maybe. Structural. Again, patterns. Rebecca stepped closer. "I didn't know if you'd come out. I was leaving anyway." She looked up toward the Keller Grid sign above the entrance. "You really built all this?" Kyle said nothing. Rebecca studied him carefully. "You still drive the same truck?" "It still works." There was that expression again. The old one. The look she used to give him whenever she could not understand why he refused to perform success the way other men did. A black SUV passed slowly through the intersection nearby. Rebecca glanced toward it automatically. Anxiety? Interesting, Kyle noticed. Always. Then Rebecca looked back at him. "We should talk sometime." Kyle slipped his hands into his coat pockets. What about Rebecca hesitated? "Just briefly, but long enough." Then she said quietly, "Trevor's in trouble." The wind shifted between the buildings. Snow drifted sideways across the sidewalk lights. Kyle looked at her without expression, and suddenly understood this meeting had been coming long before tonight. Kyle did not invite Rebecca inside the building. That was the first thing she noticed. 3 years earlier, she would have expected politeness automatically, an apology for tension, a conversation shaped around her comfort. Now Kyle simply stood beneath the cold, white lobby lights with snow drifting behind him and waited for her to explain herself. Rebecca tucked loose hair behind one ear. "Trevor's company is under investigation." Kyle nodded once. "For what?" She hesitated. "That's complicated." "No," Kyle said calmly. "Usually it isn't." The answer unsettled her slightly. Rebecca glanced toward the Keller Grid entrance behind him again. Employees moved occasionally through upper-floor windows while the company logo reflected across the wet sidewalk. You built something real, she said quietly. Kyle ignored the compliment. What does Trevor want? Rebecca looked back at him sharply. How do you know he wants something? Because men like Trevor never approached problems emotionally first. They approached strategically. Kyle had spent 3 years learning the difference. He thinks someone's targeting him, Rebecca admitted carefully. Kyle stayed silent. Rebecca folded her arms tighter against the cold. There have been complaints, contract audits, anonymous reports. Interesting. Kyle watched her expression carefully. Not fear exactly. Pressure. The kind people carried when financial stability started cracking underneath appearances. Rebecca continued. And now suddenly Keller grids everywhere. Kyle almost smiled at the connection she was making. Not logically, emotionally. To Rebecca, success automatically meant retaliation, because that was how she understood power. You think I'm behind Trevor's problems, I don't know what you're behind anymore. That sentence hung between them. Kyle looked toward the dark Denver skyline. 3 years earlier, accusations like that would have hurt him. Now they mostly clarified people. Rebecca stepped closer. He says you've been asking questions about his contracts. I haven't, but someone has. Kyle considered telling her the truth, that Trevor's problems were probably self-created, that reckless people often blamed enemies for damage caused by their own shortcuts. Instead, he simply asked, "Why are you here, Rebecca?" The wind shifted hard through the street corridor between buildings. Rebecca looked down briefly, then back up. We're drowning financially. There it was. Finally. Not pride, not manipulation. Truth leaking through pressure. Kyle remained still. Trevor overextended, she continued quietly. Too many projects. Too much debt. And he thought new contracts were coming through. Kyle watched snow gather along the curb beside her expensive boots. But they didn't. Rebecca swallowed once. You know how construction works right now? Interest rates changed. Investors pulled back. Kyle did know. Keller Grid studied market instability constantly because aging infrastructure failures increased during financial downturns. Cheap shortcuts created expensive disasters later. Again, systems. Everything became systems eventually. Rebecca looked up toward the building sign again. He says someone submitted complaints about safety compliance on 2 of his developments. Kyle's eyes narrowed slightly. That part interested him. Were the complaints true, Rebecca didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough. Kyle slid his hands deeper into his coat pockets. Then he should fix the violations. It's not that simple. It usually is. Rebecca's expression hardened. You act like the world's black and white now. No, Kyle said calmly. I act like records exist. That line landed hard, because Trevor's world depended on things remaining undocumented. Rebecca stepped closer again. He thinks Dana Whitaker's involved somehow. That surprised Kyle slightly. Dana, interesting escalation. Why? Because Keller Grid keeps winning contracts his company used to chase. Kyle almost laughed quietly. Not because it was impossible, because Trevor still misunderstood the situation completely. Keller Grid didn't compete against Trevor's company directly. Trevor sold appearance, Kyle sold reliability. Those markets only looked similar from far away. Rebecca searched his face carefully. You really don't know what's happening to him? Kyle met her eyes steadily. I know unstable systems fail eventually. She stared at him for several seconds, then shook her head slowly. You changed. Maybe. Or maybe survival simply removed unnecessary softness. Rebecca exhaled visibly into the freezing air. I didn't come here to fight. Kyle waited. I came because Trevor thinks you're going to come after us. Us? Still us? Interesting. Kyle looked toward the quiet street. I've been busy building a company. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting tonight. Rebecca's jaw tightened. For one brief moment, the old Rebecca surfaced again. the version who hated losing conversational control. "You know," she said sharply, "you could have helped us." Kyle looked back at her slowly. "How you have connections now." "There it is." Rebecca frowned. "What, you still think this works through favors?" The silence after that grew heavy. A black sedan turned slowly through the intersection nearby before disappearing toward downtown traffic. Rebecca lowered her voice again. "Trevor made mistakes." Kyle said nothing. "But he's not a bad person." That almost pulled a reaction from him. Almost. Kyle remembered Trevor standing inside his apartment drinking coffee from his mug, while Rebecca dismantled their marriage sentence by sentence. Bad person. Good person. The categories no longer interested Kyle much. Predictable mattered more. And Trevor had always been predictable. Aggressive growth, shortcuts, pressure tactics, image before structure. Systems failed exactly like that. Rebecca noticed Kyle drifting internally away from the conversation. She stepped closer again. "He says someone's trying to destroy him." Kyle finally answered honestly. "People destroy themselves slowly, long before consequences arrive." Rebecca looked shaken by that. Not emotionally. Recognition, maybe. Because deep down she already knew Trevor's problems did not begin with Keller Grid. They began years earlier with decisions nobody documented carefully enough. Kyle checked the time on his watch. "I need to go." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly. "That's it? What else did you expect?" She stared at him openly now, maybe for the first time in years. Not the maintenance worker, not the exhausted husband, not the man carrying trash bags into a freezing parking lot. Something else. Structured, controlled. Harder to manipulate because he no longer needed emotional approval to remain steady. Rebecca spoke quietly. "You don't even seem angry anymore." Kyle considered that carefully, then answered truthfully. Anger burns energy. Snow gathered along the shoulders of his dark coat. Rebecca looked suddenly tired, older somehow than 35. "You know," she said softly, "sometimes I wonder if you ever actually loved me." Kyle almost responded immediately, then stopped himself. Because the truthful answer was complicated. He had loved her once, completely, but love without respect eventually collapsed under pressure the same way neglected infrastructure did. Cracks formed quietly first. Then, suddenly, everything failed at once. Kyle opened the building door. Warm air spilled briefly across the sidewalk. Rebecca looked up at him one last time. "If Trevor reaches out to you directly?" "He already has." That startled her visibly. "When doesn't matter." Rebecca's expression shifted instantly. Fear this time. Real fear. "What did he say?" Kyle held the door open with one hand. "He warned me legal situations can become expensive." Rebecca closed her eyes briefly, like someone confirming the beginning of something unavoidable. When she looked back at him, her voice sounded smaller. "He's getting desperate." Kyle nodded once. That's usually when people make records. Then he walked inside. The lobby doors closed softly behind him. Rebecca remained standing alone beneath the falling snow outside Keller Grid headquarters, while Kyle crossed the polished concrete floor toward the elevators. Halfway there, he noticed Marcus Hill from internal IT, waiting near reception holding a tablet. Marcus looked uneasy. "Kyle, what happened?" Marcus handed him the tablet immediately. Anonymous email screenshots filled the screen. Accusations against Keller Grid, claims of stolen engineering concepts, financial misconduct, unsafe testing practices. Kyle scanned the timestamps, all submitted within the last 48 hours, structured professionally, coordinated. Marcus lowered his voice. "There's more. Someone attempted access into archived development files yesterday." Kyle's expression didn't change. From inside, Marcus nodded grimly. "Contractor credentials." Kyle already knew the answer before Marcus said the name. Hale Commercial Solutions. The lobby grew very quiet around them. Marcus swallowed once. "Should we contact legal?" Kyle stared at the screen another few seconds, then handed the tablet back calmly. "No." Marcus blinked. "No." Kyle looked toward the glass entrance where Rebecca still stood outside in the snow. Not yet. Because this was no longer emotional sabotage. This was pressure. And pressure always left patterns behind, eventually. Kyle had built an entire company understanding exactly that. The next time Rebecca waited outside Keller Grid headquarters, she arrived before sunset. Kyle noticed her immediately through the third-floor conference room windows. Dark gray coat, hands buried in pockets. Standing near the same concrete planter beside the entrance where delivery drivers smoked cigarettes during lunch breaks. Only this time she looked thinner. Not physically fragile, financially exhausted. There was a difference. Inside the conference room, Dana Whitaker continued reviewing quarterly infrastructure projections, while two operations managers discussed Phoenix expansion schedules. Kyle heard almost none of it. Not because Rebecca distracted him emotionally anymore, because repetition mattered. People repeated behaviors when pressure increased. And Rebecca had started appearing personally instead of sending lawyers. That meant something underneath Trevor's situation was deteriorating faster than before. Dana noticed Kyle's attention drift toward the window. Without turning around, she asked quietly. At her again, Kyle looked back toward the financial reports. Yes. Dana finally glanced outside. Rebecca stood motionless beneath falling snow, while downtown traffic crawled through evening congestion. Dana studied the scene briefly. She doesn't look dangerous. Kyle closed the report folder carefully. Most infrastructure failures don't look dangerous at first, either. Dana almost smiled at that. Almost. 20 minutes later, Kyle exited the building carrying 2 takeout containers from a Thai restaurant down the block. The air smelled like snow and wet concrete. Rebecca straightened immediately when she saw him. "You're busy now," she said. "Usually." Kyle stopped several feet away, not close enough for familiarity. Rebecca noticed that too. For a moment, neither spoke. City lights reflected across frozen sidewalks while office workers hurried toward parking garages nearby. Finally, Rebecca exhaled. "I need help. Direct. No performance tonight." "Interesting." Kyle waited quietly. "Trevor's company accounts got frozen yesterday." There it was. The structure underneath the panic. Kyle shifted the takeout bag slightly in his hand. For tax issues, Rebecca laughed bitterly. "I wish." That answer confirmed more than she intended. Kyle remained calm. "What happened?" Rebecca rubbed both hands together against the cold. "Subcontractor complaints turned into audits, then insurance reviews, then contract violations." Kyle listened without interruption. "3 developments stopped construction completely," she continued. "Investors started pulling funding after safety investigations opened." Kyle watched her carefully. Still polished outwardly. Still expensive coat, styled hair, controlled posture. But now tiny details betrayed instability. Chipped nail polish hidden beneath gloves, dark circles beneath makeup. Phone screen cracked near one corner. Systems always failed gradually before collapse became visible. Rebecca swallowed once. Trevor thinks someone coordinated everything. Kyle stayed silent. He thinks Dana Whitaker blacklisted him. That's not how Dana works. Rebecca looked surprised by the immediate answer. "You defend her fast." Kyle ignored that. Because it wasn't emotional. It was accurate. Dana Whitaker didn't waste energy on revenge operations. She eliminated risk through documentation and performance. Trevor probably created his own downfall, one shortcut at a time. Rebecca stepped closer. "He's scared." Kyle almost responded to that, almost. Not because Trevor deserved sympathy, because fear stripped performance away from people, eventually. Rebecca looked toward Keller Grid's illuminated sign again. "You built all this from nothing," Kyle corrected her quietly. "Not nothing. The trash bag, the laundromat room, The notebook. The freezing truck behind King Soopers. Nothing was inaccurate, only to people who had never lost stability overnight. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. I know I hurt you. The sentence arrived softly, late, but softer than before. Kyle watched snow gather along the shoulders of her coat. You threw me out with $40. Rebecca flinched slightly. Not dramatic, real. That night was messy. Kyle almost smiled. Messy. Interesting word for calculated humiliation. You already had Trevor in the apartment. Rebecca looked away instantly. Traffic lights changed across the intersection, painting shifting red reflections over the snow. Kyle spoke calmly. You cleared my side of the closet before I got home. Silence. You packed before the argument started. Rebecca folded her arms tightly. I didn't know what else to do. Yes, you did. That landed harder, because it was true. Rebecca closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them again, the confidence looked thinner than ever. Trevor says if Kellergrid stops pushing, Kyle interrupted immediately. Kellergrid isn't pushing anything, but somebody is. Yes, Kyle said calmly. Reality. Rebecca stared at him. The answer hit because deep down she already knew Trevor's problems weren't conspiracy-driven. They were structural, rushed inspections, aggressive financing, missing compliance work, too much appearance, not enough foundation. Exactly the kind of system Kyle spent his entire life repairing after collapse. Rebecca looked towards the ground. We're probably losing the condo. Kyle remained still. And Trevor owes people money. That part mattered more. Not emotionally, operationally. Debt created desperation. Desperation created mistakes. Kyle asked carefully, what kind of people? Rebecca hesitated too long, then looked back up. Investors? Suppliers? Not complete truth. Kyle recognized incomplete truth immediately now. You're leaving parts out. Her jaw tightened. You think I'm lying automatically. I think pressure edits conversations. Rebecca shook her head slowly. You really did become cold. Kyle considered arguing. Instead, he asked the only thing that mattered. What do you actually want from me? Rebecca stared at him silently for several seconds. Then finally, money. Direct again. Good. Cleaner that way. Kyle nodded once. How much? Rebecca blinked. You're asking seriously, I like numbers. The old Rebecca would have laughed at that line. This Rebecca looked embarrassed. Trevor says if we can stabilize the pending lawsuits, Kyle interrupted again. No. The answer came instantly. No anger, no hesitation, just structure. Rebecca's expression hardened. You didn't even let me finish. I already know enough. You have millions now. Kyle looked toward the passing traffic. I have payroll. That shut her up briefly, because she suddenly realized something important. Kyle still viewed money operationally, not emotionally, not socially, responsibility before appearance, exactly opposite from Trevor. Rebecca stepped closer again. You know I stood beside you when you had nothing. Kyle finally looked directly at her. No, he said quietly. You stood beside me until you thought I'd never become anything else. The wind cut sharply between the buildings. Rebecca's eyes watered slightly from cold, or maybe not only cold. Kyle honestly couldn't tell anymore. You think I'm a terrible person, she whispered. Kyle answered carefully. I think you trusted confidence more than character. Silence. Heavy this time. Real. Rebecca looked suddenly exhausted. Not manipulative, not strategic, just tired. Then her voice lowered even further. Trevor forged documents. Kyle's expression didn't change externally. Internally, everything sharpened instantly. What documents? Rebecca hesitated. Again, too long. Things connected to his projects. Not specific enough. He said it was temporary. Her breathing fogged in the cold air. Backdated permits, inspection certifications, Kyle remained still. But now investigators are looking at everything. There it was. The beginning of collapse. Not bad luck. Documentation failure. Rebecca looked up at him desperately now. If they come after him criminally, they'll destroy us. Us again. Still clinging to shared identity while standing outside another man's building asking for rescue, Kyle thought briefly about the night she threw $40 at his feet, like charity. About sleeping inside a freezing truck while she locked doors behind him. About Trevor smiling inside his kitchen. Then he looked at Rebecca calmly. You already destroyed yourselves. Her face tightened like he slapped her. For a moment, anger finally surfaced. You know what she snapped. You enjoy this. Kyle said nothing. You enjoy standing here acting superior because things worked out for you. Still, she misunderstood. Kyle didn't feel superior. He felt prepared. Big difference. Rebecca stepped backward into falling snow. Trevor warned me you'd become impossible once you got power. Kyle almost answered. Instead, he watched her carefully. The shaking hands, the cracked composure, the panic underneath years of arrogance finally surfacing, and suddenly, he realized something important. Rebecca was no longer protecting Trevor. She was protecting herself from going down with him. Then her phone rang. She glanced at the screen and visibly froze. Kyle noticed immediately. Who is it? Rebecca declined the call too quickly. Nobody relaxed declines calls that fast. Kyle's eyes narrowed slightly. Rebecca. She looked back at him. And for the first time since the divorce began, Kyle saw genuine fear underneath her expression. Not fear of losing status, not fear of losing money, fear of consequences. Then she whispered, There's something Trevor did that you don't know about. Kyle didn't respond immediately, not because he was surprised, but because Rebecca's timing had changed. For years, she spoke in emotional cycles, anger dismissal, then silence. Now she spoke in fragments, incomplete sentences, broken logic. The kind of speech pattern people used when they were no longer trying to control a situation, only survive it. Snow continued falling around them in slow, uneven sheets. The streetlights above Keller Grid headquarters buzzed faintly, reflecting off wet concrete and parked cars. Rebecca stood slightly hunched now, one hand gripping her phone too tightly. Kyle kept his voice even. What did Trevor do? Rebecca hesitated again. Longer this time. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the street like she expected someone to appear. Then she lowered her voice. He falsified inspection reports. Kyle blinked once, not surprised, just confirmation. For which projects Rebecca swallowed? 2 in Boulder, 1 in Aurora. Kyle processed that quietly. Structural inspection falsification wasn't a small mistake. It wasn't paperwork laziness. It meant systems were approved without verification. Buildings could be occupied without proper safety clearance. Insurance fraud layered on top. Regulatory exposure. Everything Trevor had built depended on paperwork integrity. And that integrity was now collapsing. Kyle spoke calmly. Who found it? Rebecca looked at him sharply. I don't know. You do. A pause. Then she exhaled shakily. Subcontractor audit flagged inconsistencies. Then insurance companies started digging. Kyle nodded once. Patterns again? Always patterns? Rebecca stepped closer, despite the cold. He says someone inside the industry is targeting him. Kyle almost laughed, but didn't. Because that narrative always appeared at the same stage. When systems failed, people externalized responsibility. He thinks Dana Whitaker is involved, Rebecca added quickly. Kyle shook his head slightly. That's not her method. You keep saying that like you know her personally. I know how she operates. Rebecca frowned. And how is that clean systems? No noise. That answer seemed to confuse her more than reassure her. She rubbed her arms tightly. This is getting worse than he expected. Kyle remained still. When systems are built on shortcuts, he said quietly, they don't fail slowly forever. Rebecca looked up at him again. There was something different in her expression now. Not manipulation, not confidence, uncertainty, real uncertainty. What happens when it collapses? She asked. Kyle answered honestly. It depends how many records exist. That sentence made her visibly tense. Records. That word again. Always returning in Kyle's world like gravity. Rebecca stepped even closer, lowering her voice further. There's something else. Kyle waited. She hesitated so long this time that the wind filled the silence between them. Then finally Trevor didn't just falsify reports. Kyle's eyes narrowed slightly. Rebecca continued quickly. He altered ownership documentation on at least one project. That changed the temperature of the conversation immediately. Kyle's posture shifted subtly. Not emotional, strategic focus. What kind of ownership documentation, investor allocation records, profit distribution agreements? Kyle exhaled slowly through his nose. That was no longer construction fraud. That was financial manipulation. Rebecca looked away. I didn't know until last week. You knew before you told me. She didn't deny it fast enough. Kyle nodded once. Why are you telling me this now? Rebecca's voice dropped. Because they're coming after him legally. Who is law firms? Investigators. One of the developers already filed a formal complaint. Kyle stared at her quietly, then asked the most important question. Does this involve Keller Grid? Rebecca hesitated. Long enough. Too long. Kyle already understood the answer before she spoke. He thinks it might, she admitted. Kyle turned slightly toward the glass doors behind him. Inside, Keller Grid employees moved through warm light and structured order. Systems operating correctly. No chaos. No improvisation. Only controlled design. Then he looked back at Rebecca. It doesn't. She blinked. What? Keller Grid isn't involved in Trevor's situation. Rebecca frowned. But he said he's wrong. That landed sharply. Rebecca's face tightened. You're sure? Kyle nodded once. Yes. A pause. Then Kyle added quietly, but someone in his circle may be trying to redirect blame. Rebecca went still. Wind pushed snow between them in thin horizontal streaks. Her voice lowered again. Trevor asked me to convince you to stop looking into anything related to him. Kyle's eyes narrowed slightly. I haven't looked into him. I know. That was the first honest thing she said all night. Rebecca swallowed again. He's scared you'll connect things. Kyle studied her carefully. You're not here as a messenger. Rebecca flinched slightly. That was accurate. Kyle continued. You're here because you're being pulled into the consequences. Silence. Rebecca's shoulders dropped a fraction. For the first time, she didn't argue. Kyle looked toward the street again. Cars passed slowly, tires crunching over thin ice. Then he spoke. If Trevor falsified ownership records, that means there's a paper trail somewhere. Rebecca nodded faintly. And if there's a paper trail, Kyle continued, someone will eventually find it. Rebecca's breathing quickened slightly. What happens then? Kyle answered simply. Legal exposure expands. She looked down at her phone again. Still no call returned. Kyle noticed everything. You should leave him, he said quietly. Rebecca looked up sharply. What, it's already unstable. Her jaw tightened immediately. You don't get to tell me what to do. Kyle nodded. I'm not telling you. A pause. I'm describing outcome probabilities. That sentence hit her differently, because Kyle wasn't speaking emotionally. He was speaking structurally, like systems analysis. Rebecca stepped back slightly. You really think everything is just systems to you now? Kyle didn't deny it. Systems explain behavior better than emotions do. Rebecca shook her head slowly. That's not how people work. Kyle looked at her directly. It's exactly how they work under pressure. That silence lasted longer than any previous one. Rebecca's eyes glistened slightly, though she quickly looked away. Then her voice dropped. If Trevor gets arrested, I lose everything. Kyle nodded once. Yes, simple. Unavoidable. Rebecca whispered, I didn't think it would go this far. Kyle watched her carefully. That sentence carried truth, but also distance, like she was separating herself from responsibility already, the way people always did when consequences arrived late. Rebecca stepped closer again, but slower now. I'm not asking for money this time. Kyle said nothing. I'm asking if there's anything you can do. There it was. The real request. Not financial, not strategic, rescue. Kyle looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the trash bag. $40, the locked door, Trevor laughing inside. Then he spoke calmly. There's nothing I can do about Trevor's decisions. Rebecca's voice cracked slightly. I know. Another pause. But there might be things you could clarify. Kyle narrowed his eyes slightly. Clarify what timeline stuff? Technical explanations. You understand how these systems work? Kyle shook his head. Not for Trevor. Rebecca's expression tightened. Why not? Kyle answered honestly. Because I don't fix systems I didn't break. That sentence landed heavier than anything before it. Rebecca stood frozen for a moment, snow collecting on her shoulders again. Then she exhaled slowly. You've become impossible. Kyle nodded once. No, a pause. I've become accurate. Rebecca stared at him. Then something in her finally shifted. Not anger, not manipulation. Acceptance of limits. She looked down at the ground. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. Kyle glanced toward the building entrance behind him. Warm light, order, structure. Then back to her. Decide whether you're inside the system or outside it. Rebecca frowned. What does that mean? Kyle answered simply. It means systems don't pause for hesitation. Silence again. This time different, heavier, final. Rebecca looked at him one last time. And for the first time since Kyle had known her, she didn't have a reply ready. Just uncertainty. Just collapse beginning quietly underneath everything she thought was stable. Then her phone rang again. This time she answered immediately. Her face changed the moment she heard the voice. Kyle didn't ask who it was. He already knew. Rebecca whispered into the phone. Trevor Kyle turned slightly toward the building doors, and as he walked inside, he heard her voice break behind him in the snow. Not anger anymore, not strategy, just fear finally catching up to reality. The subpoena arrived the next morning. Not for Kyle, for Trevor Hale. But the effect reached Kyle's world immediately. Evelyn Mercer called him at 6:42 a.m., before sunrise had fully cut through Denver's winter sky. Her voice was controlled, but sharper than usual. Trevor's situation escalated overnight. Kyle sat on the edge of his bed in the laundromat room, phone pressed to his ear. What happened? Federal-level financial review opened on 2 of his development projects. Kyle stayed quiet. Evelyn continued. They're not just looking at construction violations anymore. They're tracing ownership manipulation and falsified compliance records. Kyle exhaled slowly. That's fast. No, Evelyn corrected. That's delayed. This has been building for months. Kyle stood and walked towards the small window. Outside, the street was still half asleep. A delivery truck idled near the corner gas station. Snow melted into gray slush under early traffic. Evelyn's voice lowered slightly. There's something else. Kyle immediately focused. Tell me. A cooperating witness appeared. Kyle paused. That changed everything. Cooperating witnesses meant internal collapse had already begun. Who, he asked. Evelyn hesitated briefly. Someone from Hale Commercial Solutions. Kyle closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them again. Patterns. Always patterns. The investigation is no longer external pressure, Evelyn said calmly. It's internal fracture. Kyle leaned against the wall. Trevor's circle is breaking. Yes. A pause. And Rebecca is still inside it. Kyle didn't respond immediately. That part mattered differently. Not legally, structurally. Evelyn continued. I need you to understand something, Kyle. I'm listening. You are not involved in this investigation. Do not become involved. I'm not. Good. Because they will try to pull anyone adjacent into the narrative. Kyle understood immediately. Narratives were how people survived systems they couldn't control. Evelyn added, if Rebecca contacts you again, document everything, but do not engage beyond necessity. I already am. I assumed. Then she paused again. Kyle? Yes, this is going to get messy publicly. Kyle looked out the window. I know. Evelyn's tone softened slightly. Stay out of the blast radius. Then she hung up. Kyle stood still for a moment after the call ended. Not surprised, not emotional, just processing. Trevor's system was collapsing faster than expected. That meant pressure had reached critical mass inside his organization. And when systems collapsed, they didn't do it quietly. They dragged everything nearby down with them. 2 hours later, Kyle arrived at Keller Grid headquarters. The building felt different that morning. Not physically, atmospherically. Employees moved faster. Conversations were shorter. Internal meetings were being scheduled and rescheduled in real time. Marcus Hill intercepted Kyle near reception. You saw the news. Kyle nodded. Federal audit opened on Hale Commercial Solutions. Marcus lowered his voice. And Rebecca Long showed up earlier. Kyle stopped walking. When? About an hour ago. Asked for you specifically. Kyle looked toward the elevator bank. Where is she now? Dana sent her away. Politely. Kyle nodded once. Good. Marcus hesitated. She didn't look stable. Kyle didn't respond, because stability was no longer a useful concept for Rebecca. Inside Keller Grid's upper conference room, Dana Whitaker was already waiting. She didn't greet him immediately. Instead, she slid a tablet across the table. News headlines. Denver developer under federal investigation. Multiple construction projects. Frozen amid fraud allegations. Kyle read silently. Dana spoke first. This is expanding faster than expected. Kyle set the tablet down carefully. Internal witness accelerated it. Dana nodded. That's what we're hearing too. A pause. Then she looked at him directly. Are you connected to this in any way? No. Dana studied him for a long moment. I needed to ask. Kyle nodded once. Fair. Dana leaned back slightly. Rebecca Long came here asking if Keller Grid had any involvement. Kyle's jaw tightened slightly. What did she say exactly? She said Trevor believes someone is targeting him through industry leverage. Kyle exhaled slowly. That's not accurate. Dana nodded. I figured. A silence settled between them. Then Dana added, There's something else you should know. Kyle looked up. Rebecca tried to access your personnel records. That caught his attention. When? This morning, before coming upstairs. Kyle remained still. Dana continued. Security stopped her, obviously, but she claimed she needed information for legal clarity. Kyle understood immediately. She was trying to build defense material, or bargaining leverage, or both. Dana leaned forward slightly. I assume you did not authorize any access. Kyle shook his head. No. Good. Dana paused. Then asked quietly, Is she becoming a liability to you? Kyle didn't answer immediately, because the question was not emotional, it was structural. Finally, he said no. Dana studied him carefully. Are you sure? Kyle nodded once. She's reacting. Not acting. Dana accepted that slowly. Then she changed direction. There's another development? Kyle waited. Trevor Hale is attempting emergency asset restructuring. Kyle's eyes narrowed slightly. That means liquidation. Partial, Dana confirmed. He's trying to move funds before restrictions tighten. Kyle looked down at the table. That won't work. No, Dana agreed. It usually doesn't at this stage. A pause. Then she added, and Rebecca is still tied to at least one joint financial account. That landed differently. Kyle's expression tightened slightly. Not concern for Rebecca's finances, concern for exposure paths. If accounts are linked, Kyle said quietly, investigators will see cross-flow activity. Dana nodded. Exactly. Silence again. Then Dana said something unexpected. Do you want advice? Kyle looked at her. Yes. Dana chose her words carefully. Detach completely. Kyle didn't react outwardly. Dana continued, not emotionally, structurally. Any connection, even indirect, becomes friction in situations like this. Kyle understood immediately. Document everything he said. Dana nodded. Exactly. That afternoon, Kellergrid experienced something unusual. A press inquiry. Not about Kellergrid itself. About industry connections to Hale Commercial Solutions. Marcus brought the email into Kyle's office looking uneasy. They're asking if we worked with Trevor Hale's company. Kyle read it once, then twice. Then closed the email. No response. Marcus blinked. Nothing. Kyle nodded. No engagement. Marcus hesitated. Public perception might. Kyle interrupted calmly. Public perception follows evidence, not speculation. Marcus slowly nodded, but uncertainty remained in his expression. That evening, Kyle left the office later than usual. Snow had begun falling again, heavier than before. As he crossed the parking lot, he noticed a figure standing near the building entrance. Rebecca. Again. But different this time. Not waiting, searching. Her posture collapsed slightly when she saw him. Kyle didn't stop walking. Rebecca stepped forward quickly. I need to talk to you. Kyle stopped, but didn't turn fully toward her. Talk. Her voice shook slightly. They arrested Trevor. The words hung in the cold air. Kyle finally turned fully toward her. Not surprised, not satisfied. Just present. Rebecca continued quickly. It happened this morning. Fraud charges. Financial manipulation. They're freezing everything. Kyle nodded once. Rebecca looked at him desperately. I didn't know it was this serious. Kyle stayed silent. She stepped closer. They're saying I might be questioned too. That mattered. Legally. Kyle spoke calmly. Only if there are shared transactions or documented involvement. Rebecca shook her head. I didn't do anything illegal. Kyle nodded. That's good. A pause. Then Rebecca's voice dropped. He told me you would be involved in this somehow. Kyle looked at her steadily. And you believed him? Rebecca didn't answer immediately. That was answer enough. Wind pushed snow between them. Streetlights flickered overhead. Rebecca's voice broke slightly. I don't know what happens next. Kyle looked toward Kellergrid's glass entrance. Warm light inside, structured systems, predictable operations. Then back at her. You separate yourself from his systems, he said quietly. Rebecca frowned. What does that mean? It means you stop being tied to his outcomes. Rebecca swallowed hard. That's not simple. Kyle nodded once. No. A pause. But it's necessary. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, then whispered, You're really not going to help him? Kyle answered honestly. I can't help systems that collapse from their own structure. Rebecca flinched slightly, not from cruelty, from truth. Then her phone rang again. She looked at the screen. This time she didn't hesitate. She answered. Kyle watched her face change instantly. Fear, shock, then something like resignation. She turned slightly away while speaking. Kyle stepped back toward the building entrance. Before entering, he glanced once over his shoulder. Rebecca stood alone in falling snow, speaking into the phone, while the world around her began to shift into consequences she could no longer control. Inside, Keller grid systems continued running normally, unaware, stable, until pressure reached them too. The courthouse in downtown Denver felt colder than the streets outside, not because of temperature, but because of structure. Everything inside was designed to remove uncertainty. Stone floors, controlled lighting, measured silence between footsteps. Kyle sat on the wooden bench outside courtroom 4B beside Evelyn Mercer, who was flipping through a thick binder of documents with precise, unhurried movements. Rebecca and Trevor sat on the opposite side of the hallway. Not together anymore. That was the first thing Kyle noticed. Distance between them had increased, not physically, legally, emotionally, structurally. Trevor looked thinner than Kyle expected. Not weak, but strained. The kind of strain that came after systems stopped supporting themselves. Rebecca sat slightly apart from him, hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. Neither spoke. Evelyn closed the binder quietly. "Everything is ready," she said. Kyle nodded once. Inside the courtroom, time moved differently, slower, heavier, like every word mattered more than normal life allowed. Trevor's attorney opened first. Strong voice, controlled confidence, expensive suit, the kind of presentation designed to suggest stability even when the foundation was unstable. He argued manipulation, misrepresentation, external interference. He mentioned industry pressure multiple times without evidence. Kyle listened without expression. Rebecca's lawyer spoke next. Less confident, more reactive, claims shifted constantly between financial misunderstanding and emotional distress. At one point, the lawyer glanced at Rebecca for confirmation, mid-sentence. That told Kyle everything. Then Evelyn stood. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She placed the first document on the display screen. Timeline, clear, structured. Every event dated, logged, verified. Kyle's eviction, financial separation, joint account usage, contract formation dates for Keller grid, each layer stacked precisely on the next. No interpretation, just sequence. Evelyn spoke calmly. Facts do not change based on emotional narrative. Trevor shifted slightly in his seat. Rebecca kept her eyes down. Then Evelyn introduced the voicemail. Rebecca's voice filled the courtroom speakers. Clear, unedited. "You act like fixing pipes is going to build you a future, Kyle." A pause in the recording, then laughter. "Cold, dismissive, you're embarrassing yourself." Silence filled the courtroom immediately after it ended. Rebecca didn't look up. Trevor's expression tightened slightly. Evelyn continued. "This recording predates all Keller grid development activity." Then she placed another document on screen. Financial audit trail, credit card usage, hotel charges, dates aligned precisely after Kyle's eviction. Evelyn didn't comment. She didn't need to. The numbers spoke clearly. Trevor's attorney attempted to interject. Evelyn raised a hand slightly. "Let the record continue." Then came the forensic report. Altered document metadata, time-stamped edits, backdated approvals linked to Trevor's internal accounts. That was the moment the courtroom shifted. Not emotionally, legally. Kyle noticed it immediately. The judge leaned forward slightly. Not much, but enough. Trevor's posture changed subtly. First time, small fracture. Rebecca finally looked up. Not at Kyle, at Trevor. Something in her expression changed. Confusion first, then realization. Then something closer to fear. Evelyn finished calmly. There is no evidence of Keller Grid involvement in any alleged interference or financial misconduct. She paused, then added one final line. All fraudulent activity originates within Hale Commercial Solutions. Silence followed, heavy, final. Trevor's attorney attempted damage control, but the tone had already shifted. Judges didn't unhear structure collapse once they saw it. The hearing adjourned without immediate sentencing, but the direction was clear. After the court session ended, people moved slowly into the hallway. Lawyers spoke in lower voices. Phones rang constantly. Reporters had begun gathering outside the building. Kyle walked out beside Evelyn without looking back. Outside snow had started falling again. Rebecca caught up to him near the courthouse steps. Kyle. He stopped. Not immediately, but he stopped. She looked exhausted. Not emotionally performative. Actually exhausted. They're saying Trevor will probably face federal charges. Kyle nodded once. Yes. Rebecca swallowed. I didn't know he was doing all of that. Kyle looked at her quietly. You knew enough. That landed heavily. Rebecca didn't argue. For once, she looked down at the ground. I thought it was just accounting issues. Kyle didn't respond, because accounting issues don't require forged documents. Rebecca's voice dropped. I didn't come here for him. Kyle waited. I came because I didn't know what else I was supposed to do. That sentence was the closest thing to honesty he had heard from her in a long time. Kyle studied her carefully. Not as a wife, not as an opponent, as a person caught inside collapsing systems. You leave the system, he said finally. Rebecca frowned slightly. It's not that simple. Kyle nodded. It never is. A pause. Then she looked up at him. Do you hate me? The question hung in the cold air between courthouse steps and falling snow. Kyle considered it carefully. Not emotionally, structurally. Hate required ongoing investment, tracking, engagement, response. Kyle had none of those remaining. No, he said finally. Rebecca blinked slightly. That seemed worse to her than anger would have. You don't feel anything, Kyle corrected quietly. I feel differently than I used to. Rebecca looked down again. For a moment she looked smaller than Kyle remembered her ever looking. Then she spoke again. I think I lost everything because I didn't understand what was real. Kyle nodded once. That happens when appearance replaces structure. Rebecca gave a small, tired laugh. You always talked like that. Not always. A pause. I learned it later. She looked at him again. You're successful now. Kyle didn't respond, because success wasn't the relevant variable anymore. Stability was. Rebecca stepped back slightly. I don't know where I go from here. Kyle looked toward the courthouse doors. Inside systems were still processing outcomes. Outside snow kept falling regardless. You rebuild, he said quietly. How Kyle looked at her steadily. From what remains? Rebecca nodded slowly. Then something unexpected happened. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask for help. She simply stood there for a moment longer, then turned away. Trevor was being escorted out the side entrance by his lawyer when Rebecca passed him. They didn't speak. No confrontation, no reconciliation, just distance finalizing itself in real time. Kyle watched silently. Evelyn approached beside him. That went better than expected, she said. Kyle nodded once. Yes. Evelyn studied him briefly. You handled it well. Kyle looked toward the courthouse steps where people were still dispersing. I didn't handle anything, he said quietly. The system did. Evelyn almost smiled. That's not entirely true. Kyle didn't respond, because he understood something now that he hadn't before. Systems didn't replace responsibility. They only revealed it. That evening, Kyle returned to Keller Grid headquarters. The building was quiet again, stable, normal. Marcus met him in the hallway. It's over. Kyle nodded. Legally. Marcus exhaled, and Rebecca Kyle paused. Outside the system now. Marcus nodded slowly like he understood. Kyle continued walking. Inside his office he sat for a long time without speaking. The city lights reflected across the glass wall behind him. Denver continued moving, unaware of individual outcomes. Only systems, always systems. Kyle opened his notebook, wrote one line. Final structure stabilized. Then he closed it. For the first time in years, there was nothing left to document urgently. Outside snow continued falling over Denver like quiet correction. The first thing people noticed about Kyle long after everything settled was what he didn't do. He didn't expand loudly. He didn't give interviews. He didn't post anything online about success or revenge or rebuilding from nothing. Keller Grid Systems continued growing, but without the usual noise that came with companies reaching 8 or 9 figures in valuation. Instead, the growth felt controlled, measured, like something designed rather than something that happened. The headquarters on the edge of downtown Denver remained unchanged on purpose. Same exposed industrial piping, same plain concrete lobby, same engraved line behind reception. Failures leave patterns before they become disasters. Kyle insisted it stay there, even when branding consultants recommended replacing it with something more marketable. He declined every time. One morning, Dana Whitaker walked through the main operations floor carrying a stack of reports. She stopped beside Kyle's desk. "You know, investors are starting to call this place unusual, right?" Kyle didn't look up from the system monitoring dashboard. "In what way they say we don't behave like a scaling company?" Kyle finally looked up slightly. "We behave like infrastructure." Dana nodded slowly. "That's exactly what they mean." Kyle returned his attention to the screen. "Then they're correct." Dana studied him for a moment. "You're still thinking about him?" Kyle didn't ask who. Trevor didn't need naming anymore. "I'm not," Kyle said calmly. Dana raised an eyebrow slightly. That was a fast answer. Kyle closed the dashboard. "It's not about him anymore." Dana leaned against the edge of the desk. Then what is it about Kyle thought about that for a moment, then answered honestly. Patterns. Dana almost smiled. "Of course it is." 3 months after the court ruling, Trevor Hale's case moved into sentencing preparation. Kyle did not follow it closely. He didn't need to. Systems under collapse behaved predictably once documentation reached critical mass. Rebecca did not reappear publicly after the courthouse day, at least not in ways that intersected with Kyle's world. Once, only once, she sent a short email through Evelyn Mercer's office. No request, no manipulation. Just a single sentence: "I understand now what you meant about structure." Kyle never replied. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because response was no longer required for closure. Life continued without requiring commentary. That was something he had learned slowly and painfully. One evening, months later, Kyle drove alone through downtown Denver after leaving Keller Grid headquarters. The city looked the same, but felt different, not smaller, just quieter in his perception. He stopped at a red light near the same intersection where everything had once collapsed around him years earlier. He remembered standing in a parking lot behind a grocery store. Snow on the windshield, $40 in his pocket, a trash bag on the passenger seat. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything. Now it felt like a different version of structure being removed. The light turned green. He drove forward. At Keller Grid, new hires continued arriving weekly. Many were former field technicians, maintenance workers, people who understood physical systems better than corporate systems. Kyle rarely conducted interviews anymore, but when he did, he asked only one question. "Tell me about a time a system failed in front of you." Not theory, experience. The answers always revealed more than resumes ever could. One candidate once said, "I watched a boiler build pressure for 6 months because nobody wanted to report it properly. Kyle hired him immediately." Later that night, Marcus approached Kyle near the loading dock. "You ever think about writing a book about all this?" Kyle looked at him. "No." Why not? Kyle watched a delivery truck reverse carefully into the bay. "Because people would think it's about revenge." Marcus laughed softly. "It's not." Kyle considered the question. Then answered, "It's about maintenance." Marcus shook his head. "You really see everything as systems, don't you?" Kyle didn't deny it, because it was no longer a defense mechanism. It was simply how things appeared to him now. Later that week, Dana and Kyle reviewed expansion plans for East Coast deployment. During a break, she asked quietly, "You ever regret how things unfolded with your marriage?" Kyle didn't answer immediately. Not because he was avoiding it, but because the word regret implied something emotional, still actively unresolved. He considered carefully, then said no. Dana studied him. No regret at all. Kyle looked out the window toward downtown lights. "I regret not understanding structure sooner." Dana nodded slowly. "That's a very specific answer. It's the only useful one." Dana smiled faintly. "You're not the same person who walked into this company 3 years ago." Kyle finally looked at her. "No," he agreed. "I'm not." "Better." Kyle paused, then answered honestly. "Different." Dana accepted that, which in her language meant agreement. That winter, Kellergrid signed its largest contract yet, nationwide infrastructure monitoring across multiple commercial portfolios. The announcement came quietly. No press conference, no staged celebration, just execution. On the evening of the internal rollout, Kyle stayed late in his office alone. Snow fell softly outside the glass. He opened the old black notebook he had carried through everything. The pages were worn now, filled with entries that no longer mattered operationally. Dates, failures, observations, reactions. At the very back, he found the first entry again. $40. Trash bag. Freezing night. Kyle stared at it for a long time. Not emotionally, just observing the distance between then and now. Then he closed the notebook. Not because it was finished, but because it was no longer necessary to carry it everywhere. He placed it inside the desk drawer and locked it. Outside, Denver continued moving beneath winter lights. Cars, buildings, systems, all operating according to structure most people never noticed. Kyle turned off his office lights and walked out. As he stepped into the cold air, he paused for a moment at the entrance. The city stretched out in front of him, unchanged in shape, changed in understanding. Behind him, Kellergrid headquarters remained steady, a system designed not to impress, but to hold. Kyle adjusted his coat and walked toward his truck. Not the beginning, not the end, just continuation. Kyle's story isn't really about revenge money or even success. It's about what happens when everything external is stripped away, and only structure remains. When he was left with nothing but a trash bag and $40, there was no dramatic transformation in that moment, only silence, cold air, and the choice to either collapse or observe. What changed him wasn't anger, it was patience, documentation, and the ability to understand that people often reveal who they are through patterns long before they admit it with words. Rebecca and Trevor didn't lose because Kyle fought louder than them. They lost because they built their lives on unstable foundations, image instead of structure, urgency instead of discipline, shortcuts instead of systems. Kyle didn't win by overpowering them. He simply stopped reacting and started building something that couldn't be easily shaken. In real life, not every betrayal gets a dramatic ending, and not every injustice resolves quickly. But this story shows something quieter and more powerful when you focus on rebuilding yourself with clarity even after being underestimated or discarded, life eventually organizes itself around truth. Not emotion, not noise. Truth. If this story made you think about someone who underestimated you, or a moment when you had to rebuild from nothing, share it in the comments. I'd genuinely like to hear where you're watching from, and what part of Kyle's journey hit you the hardest. And if you enjoy stories like this, slow, intense, and grounded in real human consequences, subscribe to the channel. The next story is about someone who was betrayed, even after saving a life. And what came next changed everything.